Hey Covalence friends, welcome back to part 2 of building a Reddit client using Next.js and Tailwind. It's going to be a little bit longer than part 1, which was just kind of setting up the application. This is going to be coding the overall layout and getting the general look and feel of the app. And so please, if you haven't hit the subscribe button below, please do so now and hope you enjoy. So the first thing you want to think about when you're starting any new application is the overall architecture of it, right? And so what are we doing? What do we need? And for this application, it's super simple. We're just showing the posts from a subreddit, and by default, it'll show /r/all, and then we'll have a search input somewhere on the screen that will allow us to search for a subreddit of whatever we type in, whatever the search input is, right? And so we could do everything on a single page. We don't need multiple pages to accomplish this. And on the single page, we could have a nav bar, a main body, and a footer. And the footer can be super simple. We could expand it to be whatever we wanted in there, but for these purposes, we're just gonna have something super simple. The list itself will just be, a few cards that show posts, and then the nav bar. I'm thinking we're gonna want to put the search input in the nav bar, and so it could be a little bit fancier. But for now, we're just going to get the overall layout of the page and then add that functionality in later parts. And so to get things kind of started, we're using Tailwind. And so that means that we need to add and delete a few things from what Next has already provided us. And so in the styles folder here, you can see that we have a globals.css file that Next creates for us. In this globals file, anything that we put in here will actually be referenced as is throughout the application. So if we wanted to do like a .container class, .container. If we want to do a .container class, we can actually use the class container anywhere in our application, and in these styles will be applied to it, right? So it'll render the DOM as container, and it will apply these styles, right? Now, if we're using it in the module class here, like we can see that Next created all these classes for us in home.module.css. None of these classes will actually be referenced as .container, right? And so if we thought that if we put somewhere in our application, we put the container class on an element and we thought that it would apply padding 0 to RM, like we would be sorely mistaken there. Like it's not going to do that. These are going to be created. It's going to be something strange, like home underscore, container, some random string. And it does that so that we don't have naming conflictions or naming conflicts throughout. I don't know if conflictions is even a word. But anyway, we don't need any of these things. I will leave the container class in there just to kind of show you how that works, but we don't want to add this padding. We'll just put position relative and we'll leave it at that. So we're going to go ahead and save that. And then in here, we'll remove this container class, but what we're going to want to do is we're going to add the actual Tailwind calls. So we want to actually add the Tailwind base components and utilities. And so you can copy and paste this. It's on Tailwind's website. Basically, this just imports what's needed for Tailwind to work correctly. And this will allow us to use Tailwind classes throughout the application. This is going globals because, like I said, you want to use the classes as is. And we're going to go ahead and import those classes, the ones that we need and the ones that we'll be using. All right. So because we're going to be doing it on a single page, we already have that page created. It's going to be this home page, right? And for whatever reason, Next doesn't like semicolons. I do like semicolons, so I usually go ahead and add these in there. And you can see that styles is already imported from the module, the home module. And we have this outside container element. We'll leave that in there. We have this head element, and what that does, it's the head of our application, meaning that it contains the title, it contains potentially any JavaScript files that we would be using, and any, like fave icons, things like that we want to add. Anything that you would add to the head of your document body, you could put in here. This is a Next component, as you can see, and it basically pulls this out and puts it in the head of the document. And we're going to leave that in there, but everything else we're going to just kind of remove. We're going to remove this footer. We're going to remove the main for now. We'll add some stuff back in there. We'll add a few more semicolons because why not? I love semicolons. And we'll remove this image. All right, so we've cleaned up our home page, and we're going to want to now create our components folder, right? Because like I said, we're going to have a nav bar, we're going to have a list, and we're going to have a footer, right? And so what we can do is we can add a new folder called components, and we'll add a nav bar folder, we'll add a footer folder, and we'll add a list folder. All right. Whoops, not sure why I did that. And so in our navbar folder, we'll actually have a navbar.tsx file. And this is a personal preference, but I like having my CSS files for components in the component folder itself. Some people like putting everything in the styles folder. I don't. That's kind of your call. I just keep all of my stuff contained, and it keeps things a little bit simpler. Because like now in my navbar.tsx file, I can actually import styles from literally just navbar.module.css. I feel like it's cleaner. Some people don't like it, but that's up to you. So we're going to export our default function, navbar. And we can go ahead and return. For this, we'll keep it as a header. And we'll leave it like that. You don't need to use a header. I mean, I guess actually we'll use a nav component, right? Yeah, because it's not really a header. It's more of a nav. So we'll use a nav element. And we can do the exact same thing. So we can go ahead and just copy this whole thing. And we're going to create our footer.tsx. Put that in here, and then we'll change this. Instead of nav, we'll put a footer element. And then instead of navbar, we'll put footer.module, and we actually have to create that file too. So footer.module. Oh my gosh. Gotta change that. That's not even a real file. Writing some C#. All right. And then we'll do the exact same thing for list.tsx. Whoops. Thought I had that still copied. Bam. All right. And then we'll change that, and then we're going to change that name there, and we will, for now, just keep it as a document fragment, right? And then we actually have to add the list.module.css file as well. All right, so for now, these are going to be empty. We're hopefully going to be adding something to it later. We may not. If not, it's not a big deal. We have the file there if we need it, right? So we want to make sure that we save all of the files, and we're going to go ahead and go back to our index.tsx, and now we can start importing these, right? So we're going to import navbar from components/navbar/navbar, right? We also have import footer from component/footer/footer, and import list from component/list/list. Awesome. Now we'll just add these in here. So we're going to have the navbar. We want to have our main body area, and inside this we're going to have our list. Whoops. We can have that as, and like an element with an opening and closing tag, but it's not needed. And we'll also have our footer. All right, awesome. So now we have our navbar, our main body, which contains our list, and our footer. And so we want to change this head too. This head isn't really, explaining a lot. Let's go ahead and call our app subreddit, because it's not the actual Reddit app. It's a subreddit app, right? It's going to be showing posts from subreddits that we type in a search bar. And we'll just say it's a Reddit client that shows posts for subreddits. And this is the actual link that's going to reference the fave icon. Always save your pages, by the way. I save as much as possible. I feel like you guys probably know this, but go ahead and save it whenever you get the chance, just in case something happens. Now, the way Next works is that anything in your public file is essentially served is the root, right? So right now, this is saying that the root of our application, there's a fave icon.ico, which we can see there is one, right? Next provides this for us. If we look at this, it's just, this Vercel icon, which we don't really want. Let's just get rid of it. Then we have a Vercel.svg, which again, we don't need. So now our public folder is empty. We can go ahead and generate an icon or something that we want to use. I went ahead and just did it already. So I actually generated a whole few icons, right? So they have fave icon generators online that will actually create these for you. And so instead of just having a fave icon itself, we can have different size fave icons. So because different browsers will actually use PNGs with transparency to give you a little bit of it's a slightly better experience, right? You can have a cooler fave icon that people can look at. They also have special things for like Apple Touch and Android Chrome as well. And so just to kind of show you how that would work, we can go ahead and just kind of add these additional links in here. So instead of this just basic icon link, we will go ahead and add these additional ones here, right? And so what this is showing is this is the Apple Touch icon. This is the 32 by 32 PNG. This is the 16 by 16 PNG. And if the browsers don't support it, it'll just kind of fall back onto whatever it does support. So older browsers may not support these PNGs, and so it'll eventually just use this fave icon, which we can see is in, the root fave icon folder, and then faveicon.ico, which we have here, right? And so if you don't know how to generate this, you can just use these icons. Just look at the, the GitHub repo, which I posted below, and you'll be able to just pull the whole thing and use this fave icon, right? Awesome. So got our fave icon taken care of. We got the title of our app, which is shown in the actual tab, and we have a description, which is sometimes used when people look at SEO material, or they look at the actual content when you post a link somewhere and they generate like a pretty picture and a description for it. Things like Facebook do that. And so again, the meta information isn't essential, but it's just a little nice to have. It's pretty cool to have. And so if we wanted to go ahead and just run this real quick, we could go ahead and just npm run dev. All right, it went ahead and compiled. So we'll go to localhost 3000, and we can see there's literally nothing on the page, which is expected, believe it or not. So if we wanted to actually look in here, we could see that in the head of our body, we actually do have the fave icon in there. We do have the title in there, right? So Next did all that correctly. And then in the body of our document right now, if we want to look in here, we have this container class, which again, right, it actually has it's not just container. It's home underscore container underscore, and then some kind of GUID. I don't know where they generate this from. It's definitely something unique. And this is basically what I was saying. This is that container class. We have our nav bar, which rendered as just the nav element. We have our main, which had the list in it, but we just gave it a document fragment, so there's nothing in there. And we have our footer. So there's nothing really in here yet, right? And at least we have it somewhat laid out and ready to, keep styling, keep adding to it, and we'll have something in here in a bit, right? All right, so at least we know that it's working to some degree. Go ahead and, we'll leave it running for now, right? So let's go ahead and shrink this. Keep that running. It'll actually update as we add stuff. And what we're going to do is we're going to start adding to our nav bar. All right. So in our nav bar, what we can actually do is we can go ahead and add an inside div to the nav. And we can say that we want to actually keep it to where it's contained within a container of some kind, right? So the whole app is going to be within a container. Sometimes people will put the entire app inside of a container, but I like the navbar to stretch the whole width of the screen. Otherwise, the navbar is going to be cut off, and it's not going to expand the whole width, right? So what I tend to like to do is I like to have a set container class, right? So whatever it is, let's just say for this, let's do class name. Let's do Tailwind has a class called max width 7XL. Again, you can play with these depending on how wide you actually want it to be. But what we can do is we can say max width 7XL and then MX auto. And what this will do is it'll keep its max width to a certain width, and then it'll actually center it, right? So margin X auto on both sides. And for small apps, we can say, PX4. So this is a Tailwind component. Or the way Tailwind works, right? So you can actually, before the semicolon, you're going to specify screen size. So basically it's saying that on small devices or greater, you're going to have a padding X of 4, right? And so Tailwind has PX1 all the way up through like PX90 or 96 maybe. I forget exactly what it is. You'll actually have to go to Tailwind's website. But If we really wanted to look at that real quick, we could. tailwindcss.com, go to the docs, and then over on the left-hand side here, they have basically all of their stuff for padding, max height, min height. So if we actually looked at max width here, you can see this is what we use, the max width 7XL. And all it does is add a max width of 80 rems to it, right? Which is root ems. And again, there's a ton of different classes here. So your capabilities are pretty ridiculous in terms of like everything that you can do. You basically don't need to ever write CSS when you're using Tailwind. You can pretty much just add Tailwind classes to everything. But as you can see, px0 will make padding left 0 and padding right 0. But it goes all the way through, let's see, px96 here. It skips numbers in here, so you got to be careful about this. You got to be careful. Like, there's not a px95. I don't exactly know why they did it this way. I'm sure there is a reasoning, and if you were to read their documentation, maybe they explain it. But it skips numbers, and so you just have to be conscientious of that, and just make sure that you actually look at which one you would need and which actual amount you would need, right? And so again, back to the application, and we'll go back to the code here. So we're going to say small px4, and then on a larger screen, maybe we want px8, right? And then what we can do is we're going to put a little divide in there. It's not really necessary, but why not? On large screens, we're going to say divide y, and the divide, we want it to be gray 200, right? And I'll show you what that actually is in a bit. But inside this div, let's create another div, and this class is going to be essentially what will dictate the layout of the nav bar and also the height of it as well. So we're going to say it's going to be relative, and then we're going to say h16, which is a Tailwind class specifying an actual height in rems. And we're going to make it flex. We're going to use Flexbox. The Flexbox support is pretty good nowadays, and then Tailwind does a pretty good job with the actual implementation. And so it's very, very good across browsers. And we're going to say justify between, because in my mind, we're going to have kind of like an icon on the left. We could have the search bar in the middle, and then on the right-hand side, we could do something else. We could do something cool. Maybe maybe we'll do a dark theme, right? So maybe we'll have a little switch that we can toggle between light and dark theme. So I think that'll be interesting and probably what I'll end up going for. All right, so for now, let's just at first create the application logo. And so something I kind of like to do is I like to add a little comment in here saying that this is going to be the actual application logo. And we're going to create our div that'll contain that. And let's say class name, relative, z10, px2, we're going to add a little bit of padding, flex, and lg px0. So we're going to have a little bit of padding on mobile, but on a large screen, we want it to be px0. All right, and you'll see why in a second. Now, I'm going to add another div in here, class name. And this is going to be essentially what contains the logo itself. And so we're going to say flex shrink 0, flex item center. And inside of here, we're going to actually put the image. All right. And the source, let's just add a class name to this as well. Class name block h8 and with auto. And then the source, we actually haven't created this yet, but we'll come back to this in a second. And then for the alt, we'll just say this is kind of the the title of it. So we'll put that title in there. It's a subreddit logo, and that will be our icon there. So what we're going to need is we're going to actually need a logo for this. Again, you could create your own logo, but for now, I actually just created a logo here. So let's see. Where is this thing? All right. we're going to add a logos folder, new folder, logos, and then let's see, going to actually add this little subreddit logo. Subreddit.png is kind of cool. It's just the Reddit logo with sub added to the top. Hopefully they don't mind that. If they do, just let me know. We'll change it, take it down. Not trying to start a fight. Source / logos / subreddit.png. All right. So now our nav bar should actually have a height, and it should also contain a logo in it. So let's go ahead and go back to it. Whoa. Well, that doesn't look like what we want, does it? That's probably because our nav bar itself doesn't actually have any styling. So what we probably want to do is add a class name to the outside of it, and let's actually use this styles folder or styles file that we haven't been doing anything with. So in here we can actually create a nav bar, and we can say position, let's do fixed because it is a nav bar, why not? And then we will say left 0, top 0, and width 100%. And this is the index, it's a nav bar, so typically we want this something really high. It doesn't really matter what it is, but we want it to be higher and above everything else. So let's see if that actually changed anything. Let's go back to this. It did actually add the class here, so that looks good, but it didn't actually affect what's going on with the height and all that. So we go in here, we can actually see that none of our Tailwind classes are being brought in. So that's a problem. So let's go ahead and figure out why none of our Tailwind classes are working. All right, and I know the answer. Do you know the answer? Write it in the comments. I'm just joking. It's because that we actually didn't specify this components folder in our Tailwind content. So nothing in this components folder is actually being looked at right now. It's only looking at pages. So it goes in here and it's looking at all these styles and it's saying, oh look, none of the Tailwind styles have to be added, and so we're not actually going to add it because we're going to keep the Tailwind CSS file as small as possible. And so what we actually have to do is we have to go into our Tailwind.css config or Tailwind.js config, and we have to add the components as well. So components /*/ dot, and we're going to do the exact same thing. We can just copy and paste this little guy because why reinvent the wheel? All right. So now if it recompiles, we can actually see that it did change. Now the actual nav bar itself is only this large, which is what we want. And all of the styles themselves, as you can see, are being brought in. So we don't actually have anything actually underneath it, but what I'm thinking what we're going to do is we're going to have the nav bar be white, and then we can have the body of the document be more of like a gray, right? And so I think that'll look pretty good, and then the footer itself can be white as well. And so why don't we go ahead, we'll style the footer first. Or what we could do is I guess we could style the nav bar first. Doesn't really matter. Style the main area first. So what we could do is we'll go back to our index, and we'll just say that this main area, let's see, class name, we can say BG Gray 100, min. Let's see. We're going to want some padding, right? So padding top 24, and on larger screens, padding top 28, right? So basically, from everything from the smallest screen all the way up to what they specify as large, we're going to have padding top 24, but on large and above, we're going to have padding top 28, all right? And then on every screen, we're going to want padding bottom of around 16. Not super important or needed. And actually, that might be too much, but we'll see in a bit here. Also, just thinking of the layout here, the way that we have this right now, And again, this happens all the time in development, so I'm literally doing this real time. And one of the things I like to do is I don't like to like edit content or reshoot content too often. And so I'm looking at this right now and I'm thinking about it. And the nav bar is position fixed, but the footer is going to end up being more of like an absolutely positioned element, right? And this main content, we want it to stretch the whole length of the screen, right? And so our styles.container, it doesn't have to have a height necessarily, but it could, right? So we could make this thing, we could say this, right? We could change this here. We'll actually make this a variable. And then we could say min h screen, right? So we're going to say the min height of this element is the height of the screen, all right? Which gives it a physical height. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to go in here and do something like this, where we can say like h full, right? And h full, what that does is it gives it height of 100%. And that'll be 100% of this screen, of this element, right? But what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that our footer was going to be outside of that element, which we don't want. We actually want it to be inside of this main. And so we can pull this main inside, and what we could do is we could create a wrapper. If we didn't want our footer in the main content, we could actually move, have a wrapper that's outside of this, and then our main inside that wrapper. But that's kind of up to you whether or not you want to do that. To keep things cleaner, let's go ahead and do that just so we can keep our main content in there. So we're going to keep this a little bit easier. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to change this. We're going to add these class names up here instead. So our main itself isn't actually going to have a class, those class names on it. All right. And then we can also add a relative here, relative class, and this makes position relative on here. It basically does the exact same thing as the styles.container, but if we wanted more than just position relative on here, we could add it, right? That's the power of that. We're doing this for learning purposes. Generally, you'd want to just put relative if you wanted, relative positioning there. All right. So now that means our footer, let's go ahead and actually just save this and take a look at what that actually changed. All right. So as you can see, we have our nav bar, but something is still wrong, right? Because now this itself is just the padding. And h full height 100% isn't actually, so that's a typical, that's a funny actual, like a pretty funny little thing that happens with browsers and whatnot. This knows that its min height is 100 VH, but because it's min height and not height, you can't do a height of 100% on this. And so believe it or not, this min height here is basically useless. And again, we can just remove this. It's no longer needed. All right, we're just going to leave that on there as styles.container. We can add it later if we want an additional class. But instead, we're going to make this div, this wrapper, is going to be min height screen. All right, and now what that's going to do is it's going to change, and we now have it spanning the entire width, like height of the screen, right? And our nav bar is up here still, and maybe what we can do is we can actually make this nav bar a different color because it's just kind of transparent at the moment. We said we wanted it to be white, and again we have styles.navbar. Let's go ahead and leave that on, reference this variable, but then we're also going to put VG white on there. All right, so now we have the white nav bar, we have the gray body, and what we want is the white footer on here. So real quick, we're gonna have a pretty simple footer, and we're gonna want it to be white, just to kind of break things up a little bit. So class name, VG white. We want it to be absolutely positioned. We're going to say left 0. These are all, again, Tailwind classes. We want the width to span the entire way. So I don't know if you guys know, but once you put absolute positioning on here, the width now will just extend to be the width of the content, and so you actually need to specify width full. If it's a relatively positioned or a statically positioned element, it's going to by default have width 100%. But once you put this absolute positioning on there, you actually have to specify the width as well. And we'll say Z50, that's a Tailwind class. We're just going to increase the Z index. We're going to make it absolutely positioned. We're going to say left 0, bottom 0, and then we're going to make it, the full width of the class. And let's go ahead and just add a div in here. And in this div, we're going to do the exact same width as, or the exact same thing that we did with this class itself. But instead, what we could do, we could actually just probably center the text itself. So we don't actually need this per se. We could get fancy with it, but instead, let's just keep it super simple and just say text center. And we're going to have a little span in here. We want the text to be super small. So we're going to say text XS. And we're going to do a copyright 2022. Let's just say we'll get the little copyright symbol in here. And we'll say 2022, right? This is when we created it. If you wanted to use some JavaScript and actually set the date itself, you could say 2022 dash, current date dot now, or date, dot get full year, something along those lines. Something kind of like this, right? It would be like date dot get full year, or new date. Dot get full year. Something along those lines. You could do something like that. Bam. So copyright 2022 to whenever. Of course, this logic is bad since it is 2022. So this would just say 2022 to 2022. But that would just be, if you wanted to kind of get fancy, you could do some if logic, and you could do, if it is 2022, don't show this. But for now, we're just going to leave that as is. And we're going to take a look at what we got here. And we can see that right now it shows copyright 2022. A little bit ugly looking, potentially what we want to do is add a little bit of padding in here. And so let's see, what we could do is in this text center, we could just say, let's make it the same height as the footer, or sorry, as the nav bar. Add a little bit of padding on everything, but we'll just say on small devices, we'll change it up, make sure the padding is similar to the nav bar itself. And yeah, that's it for now, I think. Let's just see if that worked. Yeah, we added the height. Oh, copyright is near the top, so we're going to actually need a little bit of, we want it to be centered, right? And so what we could do is we could either add padding to the top of this thing, or we could use Flexbox. Why not? We'll just use Flexbox. Flex. Item center, I think we're actually going to change it to a div. Yep, and then because we now are using Flexbox, it doesn't like, the text center idea, so we actually have to justify center as well. All right, and then bam. So now we have it right in the dead center. And that text center is probably no longer needed, but we'll leave it there for now. And what we now have our nav bar set up. We have our main content, which will contain our list, and we have our footer. So now we're ready to get started in the next part on building that list. All right, guys. So hopefully all that made sense and was pretty straightforward. Again, we just kind of coded out the overall general look and feel of the application. We had our nav bar with the logo. We have our main content, or our main body, which is going to contain the list of posts, and then we have our footer as well. Be on the lookout for additional parts, and if you haven't hit that subscribe button below, make sure you do so that you can go ahead and be ready for future parts and future releases as we continue to build this thing out and get it deployed. Hope you enjoyed.